So this video is about an issue that has really bothered me, and that has to do with the Coptic Church, specifically about why people are leaving the Coptic Church, specifically youth in the diaspora, but also more so in Egypt and Sudan. Now it bothers me because I'm a Coptic youth myself. I grew up in the church. I was raised by it in many ways. And it saddens me to see this silent exodus. But I think the biggest cause of this isn't Satan or society. The biggest enemy, unfortunately, is a mentality that is within the church. Now, it's not just me realizing this issue. It's the clergy itself, the establishment, the bishops, and the Pope himself. And they realized it to such an extent that a couple of years ago, they actually released a survey, the Coptic survey, asking youth, essentially, it was released through Coptic World, asking, why are you leaving the church? And it consisted of a number of multiple choice questions, some of which, in my opinion, were a bit loaded, but nonetheless, it was a great effort on the part of the church to really try to understand why youth are leaving the church. Is it contemporary issues? Is it the teaching? Is it personal issues with the priest? So on and so forth. Is it problems with the service? And it was a great survey. Unfortunately, 2 years on, and I haven't seen any results of this survey. So what I did soon after that survey was administered, having that suspicion that I would never see the results, is that me and a few friends, we conducted our own survey. We went on SurveyMonkey and we put together 6 relatively short questions. One of them only was multiple choice. The rest were free text. Basically asked youth, why are you leaving the church? And we took the results. We had over 100 results, or 100 respondents within a few days. We took those results and we analyzed them. Because a lot of it was free text, we tried to look for patterns in words being used and phrases and ideas, which are a bit harder to quantify, but we were able to do that. And we found some interesting results, which you'll see right here. We broadly tried to classify the results with a few overarching themes. One of them being teaching and practice, one being personal problems with the church, one being secular society, personal problems with the clergy, lack of spiritual direction, cultural barriers, an anti-intellectual spirit, contemporary issues, moralism, misuse of church resources, and lack of involvement. So as you can see here, personal problems with the church and with the clergy, both of those put together really dominated. And I think that says a lot about the need for clergy to really be aware of the needs of youth in their church, to really be able to forge a relationship with youth, to really try to understand them. And oftentimes, where that clergy is coming from, sort of ethnically or educationally or culturally, may not totally relate to some youth, right? And that causes strain in the relationship. He's just not understanding me, right? That's one issue. But what I wanted to talk about today is specifically around the teaching and practice section of it and the anti-intellectual spirit, which together is about the same as personal issues with the church. We tried to break that down and understand, okay, this teaching and practice issue, what did that really constitute? And that was the single biggest barrier, single biggest reason that people mentioned on why they think people are leaving the church. In the past few years, it's been interesting. I've noticed a resurgence in interest in the patristic writings, and that's spurred on in part by sort of the Eastern Orthodox neo-patristic revolution, and in part by a second-generation diasporic youth like myself questioning their beliefs as they enter critical junctures in their faith, right? Or critical junctures in their life, in their spiritual and moral lives and intellectual lives, right? We're taught in universities to challenge the establishment, to challenge authoritarian figures, whether political, social, economic, religious. Challenge them not to accept what they say based on the fact that they hold a certain class in society, but based on the idea, to scrutinize the idea. Fortunately, on the other hand, what you have serving the youth are the clergy, who unfortunately have not been raised in a society that values critical thinking, that values challenging authority figures. In fact, it's quite the opposite in Middle Eastern countries, and that's mostly a cultural thing. and what happens when they meet head-to-head with youth that are challenging authority figures, or perhaps challenging ideas that have, in one sense, an authority. They dole out responses that are oftentimes either too simplistic, insufficiently nuanced, or just dreadfully unsatisfactory. Because of this, some youth have actually turned to the early church fathers, and some priests are starting to as well. Some have also turned to Eastern Orthodox ideas, to the church itself, and many others have just decided to dissociate themselves altogether from the church, to, proverbially throw out the baby with the bathwater. Some of the issues that raised, particularly in our survey, were ideas about the original sin, for example, creation, salvation, theosis. The idea of original sin, for example, that's an Augustinian idea. It's a Western Augustinian Catholic idea, and it's also not really an Orthodox idea. Yet it's still taught to this day. I've had personal spats with clergy, friendly spats nonetheless, with clergy about this very idea. And that is despite a copious amount of theological writings on the Eastern and, to some extent, the Oriental side, tackling this idea of original sin and really bringing up the notion of ancestral sin, which is what we've always believed. One thing that I've noticed that has spurred on this revival in anti-religious mentality in general in society, which does have an effect on youth within the church, is the new atheist movement that started in the mid-2000s with books by Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, and Christopher Hitchens. And that really came on the heels of the September 9/11 attacks that were really thought to be influenced by Islamic or religious ideologies. But see, those books, those bestsellers, like The God Delusion, for example, they've affected youth, and they've affected the discourse that happens within universities, right? I remember distinctly one youth asking a priest about dinosaur bones, right? If they're millions of years old, did they how does that square with the Genesis account, the literal reading of the Genesis account? And I remember the priest responding with such reassurance that the church accepted microevolution but not macroevolution. Well, first off, who is the church to accept and not accept certain scientific ideas? And secondly, the distinction between micro and macro is spurious at best. Really, the same processes drive both. But he went on, and it got even better, and he said that the dinosaur fossils were made to look old by Satan in an effort to deceive scientists, and that evolution by natural selection was actually an unsubstantiated theory. And those platitudes may temporarily allay the concerns of youth, sitting there in front of him, but they really blow over very quickly in the courtroom of science and in the classroom of the university hall. Evolution is a fact. It's accepted by over 97% of scientists across a gamut of disciplines. Of course, it wasn't until years later that I had stumbled across a plethora of Eastern Orthodox resources drawing on the teachings of the Church Fathers, which thought that scriptures are not necessarily scientific, literal texts, that a harmony can be found between science and faith, and that this harmony is attested by many modern-day Christians, Orthodox and not Orthodox, like Francis Collins, John Lennox, George Coyne, John Polkinghorne, and Carl Giberson. And I think at the root of our theological misgivings is really a misunderstanding of what Scripture is within the church. What is the Bible in the church? Within the first 100 years of Christ's ascension into the heavens, there was a lot of writings about Jesus, in the first and second century. But it wasn't really until Irenaeus in the, I guess it was the 2nd century, that really started to put together and start to elucidate what we know today to be the canon, right? Which consisted of the Septuagint and, the letters of Paul and the Gospels, though there are many others flying around, right? And this library, if you will, was really a blend of poems and songs and letters and stories and prophecies and laws and gospels. But they all were put together for one reason, because they had one thing in common, and that is Christ. And in our nature as the Alexandrian heritage was to really exegete Christ of the New Testament from the Old Testament, right? And then, the Greek methods of allegory and typology were actually first set out by St. Paul himself in scriptures, talking about Noah and Jonah and so forth. Now, those weren't at the expense of literal translations, but as St. Paul himself mentions, the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. And I'm finding today that those words ring so true. The literal letter does indeed kill the faith in many ways, but the spirit of that letter, that word, that Old Testament story, can really bring life. In understanding the context of the Old Testament and what the writers were thinking as they were writing, which is a very hard idea to understand and to try to get at, we start to begin to adopt an appreciation for the limits of the writer's understanding of the natural world, and understand the frameworks in which they were working. Unfortunately, what's happened in the Coptic Church is that we've been bombarded on two ends. On the left, we have an Islamic understanding of how to read holy books, specifically the Quran, that everything's literal, passed down by God, word for word. But on the right, we have Protestant influence that began to seep into Egypt in the 1800s, in the 1850s, with Dutch and American converts going in and trying to talk about and really preaching Protestant understanding of Scripture. But although, of course, back then many Copts were not educated in any way to begin with. But you have this literalism. We're pinched by literalism in the Coptic Church from Islam and the Protestant understanding of Protestant fundamentalism. In fact, the idea of inerrancy wasn't really fully mentioned as such, inerrancy, until the 1900s, right? The 1970s, I believe, the Chicago Doctrine. And that's when the Bible began to be reframed not as a book of faith, necessarily, not just as that, but also as an authoritative textbook on geology, paleontology, astronomy, biology, and history. And then any findings that contradicted a literal reading of the Bible must therefore immediately be dismissed. And what does that breed? That breeds a spirit of anti-intellectualism, a spirit of fear of writers and science and so forth. I remember a priest once telling one of the youth, and the youth told me about this, that the Bible was divinely dictated, and the Bible even said so. Of course, it doesn't, but this priest was really peddling a literalist, fundamentalist understanding of Scripture. I'm going to devote another video to this, obviously, and there'll be many more to come, but I just thought I'd share that with everyone, and leave your comments below. I'd love to read them, and more to come.